I want to have a disclaimer on my talk because if you read the abstract, it was a very theoretical, philosophy-oriented abstract. And once I received the guidelines by the authors to make it more focused about our everyday experiences, I reshaped the talk a little bit so that I will use Damasio's argument about Descartes as an illustration, but I've structured the talk now around 3 stories of real-life experience of practice interdisciplinarity. So I did my first path of education in philosophy. I got my master's, my PhD, and at the time everything was simple, as it always is in philosophy. And when we talked about people, we said subject. And the subject of experience was just your abstract concept of a person, and that was fine. And then I decided that all of the theoretical models were nice and fine, but I also wanted to get some experience from actual people. You know those subjects? Well, I wanted to add an S to it and see what actual people were experiencing. So I decided to go into a neurology department and to learn what it was like for actual subjects. Except that there weren't subjects there. They were patients. It's like, fine, okay, it's just a word difference. I can deal with that. We're probably still thinking and talking about the same thing. Wasn't true. Then I did an internship, and in one nursing home they were called residents. In another they were called persons. And in some occasions, which is like ultra taboo in the French healthcare, they were called clients. And I started to realize that actually when we use different words, we mean different things, and we refer to different contexts of frameworks, practices, relationships. And it was way more complicated than I thought originally. And then I started a second PhD, this time in psychology. And oh my, they use the same word that I used from the beginning, except that in this instance, when my colleagues say, oh, I have a subject coming in, they don't talk about the subject with a capital S that we refer to as philosophers. They talk about an actual person coming to do an experiment. And so we have subjects of experiments that are not at all the subject of experiment that I had in philosophy. And I started to learn this valuable lesson that even when we use the same words, we may not mean the same things. So things became really complicated, but at least I had learned my first lesson. Vocabulary matters. And it matters when we use different words, but we mean the same things, but we may not be aware of it because they're coming from different traditions, different disciplines, and different frameworks of reference where the problems we even address are completely different. Or are they? And it matters when the concepts are the same. The word actually is the same, but the concepts and the meanings are very different, and we need to elucidate that and to identify it in order to speak to one another properly and to know what is in question. So examples of that, and I am fully aware of my prejudice as a philosopher when I say a transparent concept about the mind and consciousness, but if you have a conversation between a philosopher, a neurologist, and a psychologist, and you talk about the mind, seemingly everything will go okay, and that's a big illusion. And if you say consciousness, it's going to be the same problem. So, for instance, if you have the subject of consciousness, or subject and consciousness, and you're a philosopher, you think subject as opposed to object. So, what is subjective in the nature of consciousness as opposed to objective? If you're a psychologist and you say subject and consciousness, you're likely to think consciousness as opposed to the unconscious. And so to which extent are subjects conscious of their social biases, for instance, as opposed to unconscious of them? And if you're a neurologist and you think subject and consciousness, well, in what state of consciousness is the subject? Are they unconscious? Are they minimally conscious? Are they fully awake and aware? In other words, the topic of conversation has completely changed depending on who you're talking to. And so that's what I mean by vocabulary matters. Now, how do we clarify this? How do we practice this rule of vocabulary matters in everyday life? Well, I think that we need to identify and explicit any technical vocabulary that we use. And that's easy when you're new to a discipline and you come, like when I started psychology, and I was like, what do you mean by X? What do you mean by Y? Because everything was weird and odd, and so I was aware that there was a technicality at stake there, which I wasn't anymore about my own philosophical concepts, because I had come to practice this language as a second nature. So one thing that's especially hard is kind of always having this third perspective about yourself, your knowledge, your vocabulary, to be aware of when you use a term that is actually technical in your discipline or in the context you're using it, as opposed to transparent, even when it sounds transparent and people think they know exactly what you're talking about. And that's really hard to do for your own discipline. It's a little bit easier once you start practicing with many different people because you start placing the nodes of misunderstanding and then you know what to define. The other thing is be cautious, we're going to come back to that, of the common language. All of those terms that don't sound technical, but that actually have highly technical implications in specialized studies. And we'll go back to the common knowledge, the common language, because it's a hidden danger of interdisciplinarity. We want to agree on the language, we want to find this common basis, and while doing so, we need to be extra careful. And the last point I have here, which is not too surprising as a philosopher, is beware when you analyze old texts. So all the classicists are probably going to nod and be happy that, yes, thank you for acknowledging that. You can't just copy-paste all of your modern understanding and grid of lecture of the world, because when you do that, you denature what was the context of reference at the time. And that's one of the first struggles I had with Damasio, trying to say Descartes has no account whatsoever about emotions as a physical process. It's like, yes, he does. Of course he does. Well, he calls them passions of the soul, but you know, that's what it's about. And neurologists were like, passions of what, the soul? No, that's not scientific. There's no way this can be what we mean by emotions, except if you account for the anachronism that you're doing when you're looking for, you know, emotions as a brain function, placed back in the 1640s of Descartes' science, which doesn't have anything exactly like that, but which has a similar phenomenon that has a similar place in the constellation of mental phenomena, if you account for the difference in scientific states of the knowledge at the time and the vocabulary, the conceptual framework that was at play then. So those are some examples. Of course, it's not exhaustive, but those are some examples in how vocabulary matters. And that was my first very intuitive and very immediate lesson about practicing interdisciplinarity. The next two are far less obvious, but I think for that reason, even more important. One second story was, what is philosophy, to start with? And I discovered that because I did all of my studies in France, and then I transitioned as a postdoc at Harvard in the philosophy department to start with. And I thought that would be okay, well, maybe English would be some trouble, but it would be philosophy, so that's fine, we'll have a common language. And once you asked me before transferring to Harvard, what is philosophy, I had an easy answer. Well, you know, easy in philosophical terms. But I had a frame of reference. I knew which authors were canonical in the field. I knew, you know, the proof of the existence of God was a totally classic problem, and metaphysics were one big, largely represented subfield in philosophy. Except that once I sat in the classrooms at Harvard, all of a sudden I became utterly confused, because what they named philosophy is a completely different set of authors, problems, questions, and subfields. And so all of a sudden, everybody was talking about Frege, Russell, and Carnap, and I was like, well, okay. And language and meaning was one of the proponent problems in the philosophy as it is practiced in pretty much the rest of the world, except France, where we have a very historic approach to it. So what I learned there is that context matters. And it's just one illustration of what I mean by context matters, of course, because context is this proteform notion, which I think is not immediately transparent when we start practicing interdisciplinarity, but is deeply rooted in all of the troubles we're going to run into. Context, not only international, and of course doing international research is a form of interdisciplinarity. For the example I just brought up, we call even the way the fields are divided is different based on institutional history and who are the proponent authors of the field, where's the accent, where's the funding, is also determining national priorities about research. but also context in a much broader sense, which is, what are you looking at as your research topic? And in this research topic, what does the word consciousness or mind mean? And that's where you start creating important distinctions that are going to really be operational in your dialogue with other colleagues. So let me provide an example with that. The first one, the bottom is cut, so there are references, but this one is in press. That's a study that I did last year, because as an international student, I was highly aware of how our national representations may vary across countries. I thought, okay, one of my field of research is Alzheimer's disease, and when I go to conferences around the world, all of the specialists seem to agree rather, well on what Alzheimer's disease is. Problem is, once you then import the general knowledge and principles that you learn in those scientific conferences to your country and your practice, you bump into national institutions, a difference between healthcare, a difference between health insurance companies, and how this affects the notion of healthcare and the practices of healthcare. And so I just took it to the root. Like, let's assume I don't know anything. We're gonna ask 100 people from Paris, 100 people from Boston, what pops into their mind if I just say Alzheimer's disease? And I leave it at that. No framework, just an open question. Give me the 5 first words that pop into your mind when I say Alzheimer's disease. And you've guessed it by now, but of course the representation was very different. And one key difference that I found is that the Bostonian population was very centered on the emotional response they had to Alzheimer's disease. It's sad, it's heartbreaking, it's so depressing. Whereas the French, who, I'm explaining that because they've had like multiple campaigns, public campaigns of information that were centered on the symptoms, that's what popped out. And people told me loss of autonomy, loss of independence, loss of memory, loss of orientation, loss of vocabulary. All of that was focused on symptoms and not so much on their subjective response to the disease. Well, that shapes policies and how we're going to address public concerns, because what people have in mind when you talk about this simple thing that seemed to be objectively defined by the DSM or other like objective description in the medical world, all of a sudden, when you take into account the social reality and the context, becomes different. Another example, because that was the abstract that was accepted, was on Damasio's error. So an example from Damasio's reading of Descartes. Damasio writes this huge book and entitles it Descartes' Error. Damasio is a neurologist, and the next book he writes is Spinoza was right. Not the right way to get friends in philosopher circles. You create a partition here. Anyway, to my point, let's see how the context plays out in a reading that was interdisciplinary in the goal that it was setting itself, and let's see how that may have biased the conclusion Damasio was drawing. Damasio is reading Descartes' work, and I'm putting Damasio on the left, and the text that I'm bringing up on the right. Damasio is reading from the Principles, which is a big, theoretical book. And we're gonna, let's see. You all know cogito ergo sum. That's where he starts. His interpretation of cogito ergo sum in part implies that there is a chronological relationship such that you need to think first before you can exist. That's Damasio's reading. And his objection, which I put at the bottom, is that Descartes is obviously wrong because we all have to exist before we can think. In other words, he's attacking this chronological relationship. Problem is, he's not accounting for the context of this specific claim of the cogito ergo sum. And the context, which is the problem at stake, what Descartes was wrestling with when he's coming up to this very famous formula, is what can we know for certain once we rule out sense data? In other words, once we remove the body and everything we learn from our sensations, what can we know for certain? What can be a foundation for knowledge? Well, that's a very specific question. And if Damasio is concerned with, Descartes puts the body out, that's important to know that it was part of the definition of that passage to put the body out. Now, if you read other texts of Descartes that may be less known, but that's where the specialist comes in, right? Like the Treatise of Fetus, where the problem is not about foundation of the knowledge anymore, but is what kind of being are we? What kind of being is man? Then we come to a clear annotation of Descartes' claim, by which, of course, the body comes first. With the mind, at the first stage of the fetus, the body and the mind are too close together for the mind to really separate from the body and make the body an object of thought. So we start conjoined, and then the mind gains maturity and is able to put the body as an object of thought and theorize about it. So of course in this case, Damasio is completely misinterpreting what the cogito actually means, because he's not taking into account the project of this very specific part of the argumentation and this very specific texts. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep running, but that was an example from Damasio. Okay, third life story. You want to do interdisciplinarity, and as an enthusiastic philosopher, I'm coming up to my first neurologist, and they say, okay, what do you want to do? I'm not sure I understand. So you try to explain with all of your philosophical concepts, and it's perfectly clear to a philosopher, and the neurologist looks at you like, okay, what's my gain in this? Like, how is that going to improve anything I'm doing? Why should I be interested in that? So once I started interacting with not only neurologists, but psychologists, neuropsychologists, psychiatrists, everybody was talking their own jargon, but they were all asking me for the English boiled down version. And I encountered my third lesson here. Because actually, when you're trying to translate your specialist's question coming from one discipline to a number of other specialists in different fields, you're walking a very fine line with high stakes. You need to select short passages because obviously when I'm talking to a neurologist, they're not going to read all of Descartes, and they're probably not interested in the Treatise of Fetus in the first place. So when I select passages, they have to be short, but I have to select them extra carefully to make sure I'm not misrepresenting the knowledge I'm trying to transmit. Then they want to skip the details that are only of interest for the specialists, and that's fair and understandable. But then you have to pay attention which details you're sacrificing and which details you're skipping. And that's what I'm trying to do in this talk, like communicate something that's really specific and really grounded in the history of philosophy, but at the same time skipping, Cartesian from this period as opposed to Cartesian to that period, who have different readings of Descartes. And then building common ground, we can come back to that in the Q&As if I don't have too much time on this, rather than trying to reduce it to the common language. We saw that common language is tempting. And when you're trying to translate your specialized research, it's tempting to try to make it in English, the short version, the easy version. The problem with that is we all think that the common language is transparent and is easy for everybody to approach. And by doing that, I believe that at least in some cases, we actually sacrifice enough specificity that we make the dialogue poor instead of making it easier. And so a lot of this means try to build a common ground by which you start by defining some technical terms that you agree on using to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, rather than trying to downplay it to the level where we're actually going to miss important distinction capacity to have a productive talk and conversation. So my third principle was to learn that simple is not easy, and that's a big distinction. All right, I'm going to skip this because it's not a philosophy conference. If you want some more, I'm overly excited to tell you more. But in summary, the three principles that I've learned in practicing interdisciplinarity: vocabulary matters, they're false, obvious concepts because we use them all the time, but they mean very different things across fields and time. We tend to project our own reading either from our field or from our time on old text or text from abroad or different field, and that's problematic. You know how in housing, the housing market, they always say location, 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 that's the key to the value of a property? Well, context, 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 that's the key to the meaning of every concept or passage. You need to be aware of the concept, the time period, the discipline, the problem that was at stake. And in trying to give a simple representation, beware of not oversimplifying in a way that you would misrepresent your disciplinary message by selecting famous but inadapted passages or by skipping key distinctions. And for my last 2 slides, I wanted to give you like a final story, some practice of interdisciplinarity. I always find myself looking like that or feeling like I'm like that. First thing, when you learn and you want to try to be interdisciplinary, it's hard to balance competence. I started by being fluent in philosophy because in France you don't have double majors, so I didn't have a choice. I did my whole curriculum in philosophy and I felt fluent. And then I started going to psychology and I was like, wow, this doesn't help me understand the language of psychologists. So I focused all of my efforts learning the psychology framework, problems, mindsets, vocabulary. And I started feeling like I was losing the fine-grained detail capacity that I had in philosophy. Just like now that I've been speaking, living, and breathing in English for 4 years, I have trouble gaining the same level of specificity that I used to have in French when I was writing. It's okay, and if you keep balancing back and forth, you'll regain your fluency in both domains. Second question, facing the question, what are you? Are you a philosopher? Are you a neuropsychologist? Are you this beast that has, an elephant, a giraffe, and a bear in the same thing? Well, identity for somebody who works on the sense of self is flexible, it's fluid. You determine depending on the context you are, and it's fine, even if academia is pressing us to get a label on our forehead. And one thing is, when I got enrolled by my current PhD advisor, Ken Nakayama, he told me, you're not duck, but I love odd ducks. And so he took me in, is like, because of my being weirdly shaped, having a breadth of interest and having skills and collaborations from, across the world and across the fields. And the last one is final theory, lesson learned. You may have to go over, an abyss or over a rock, but that's why I came into research. Like, I want to be a trailblazer. I want to discover some path that hasn't been already marked. Finding mentors is an extraordinary experience at becoming a mentor, because for my PhD in philosophy, we didn't have an expert that could cover the entire field. We had philosophers, neurologists, and psychologists, and none of them talked the language of the others. Well, I had to pull them together. Some of them were across different continents. And by doing that, I became a better leader, able to pool resources from different fields and stakes together in a joint project. And the last one is, when you talk to multiple audiences, and I think that's important to stress to students in a world where academia is not going to be 100% of our job opportunities, you get a fantastic training at reframing what you're doing, depending on who you're talking to, and showing them how it can be important for them and interesting for them. And I think that's a huge asset given the job market in academia right now. Thank you very much.